Good evening. Thank you to Jess for that warm welcome. Felt like a Greek wedding, which of course I loved. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you to the Conway Hall for having us. This venue is gorgeous and very cozy, very library. I love it. For those of you that don't know, my name is Cosi, and my background is in ancient history, but specifically ancient Greek material culture. So I'm going to be learning right along with you tonight, asking lots of questions. Just so you know, we're probably going to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how vigorous the discussion gets. And then we'll open it up to questions. So just so you know, if you have any burning questions to ask, there will be time at the end. And also, after the event, we have an extra special treat that we've organised. We've got a sort of, you would have seen when you came in, there's a little like pop-up market outside. So Kaarina will be signing books and selling copies of Fulvia, and I've got a little bunch of my merch. And Lucy, who is here, if you want to stick up your hand, I lovingly peer pressured her into making handmade Roman wreaths for tonight that are on sale, if you guys are keen. So without further ado, let's hand over to our three lovely panelists. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about you and what you do. Jess?
Okay. Hello, I'm the clumsy one. I am Dr. Jess Fenner. I'm an ancient historian and an archaeologist. I also specialise in material culture. I'm mostly a Pompeian archaeologist, so my biggest love is ordinary people, working class people in the early imperial period. So I try and reconstruct how people lived from their spaces and their material culture. So yes, so I'll hopefully bring an ordinary to these amazing, the amazing dimensions they're going to bring. So we'll see how that goes.
I'm Anna Cargill-Martin. I am a Roman historian. I focus mainly on the late Republic and the early Empire. I brought out a book a couple of years ago on a very scandalous, badly behaved Roman empress called Messalina. She reigned as the wife of the Emperor Claudius between 41 and 48 AD. Lots of sex, lots of murder, all the things that the Romans were best at. And I'm currently doing a doctorate on political sex scandals in Rome. So it's just like gossip from 2,000 years ago. It's very fun.
My name is Kaarina Parker. I am an author. I'm also from New Zealand, if you can't tell from my dulcet tones. My debut novel, Fulvia, has just come out. It is historical fiction set in the late Republican era of ancient Rome, and it's the first of two books that I'm doing, basically following the life of this exquisite woman who was a real figure in history, but obviously it's a slightly fictionalized take on her life. She was murderous and vengeful and ambitious and just delicious. So, yeah.
Thank you for those intros. I wanted to start tonight off with kind of a more personal question, it can be a sappy question, which is, when did you first sort of have that moment of becoming really passionate about ancient Rome? I know for a lot of people it can be a book or a particular museum visit when you're like 7. So I wanted to know that from all three of you, what was your kind of moment where you first started developing a passion for this topic?
Well, not to be a cliche, but I had a massive crush on Julius Caesar as a teenager. So that sort of started it. There's like one particular statue where the bone structure is just
I feel like Anna knows the one that you mean.
And you know, like, yes. And I learned a little bit about him in school, and then I devoured Con Eglinton's Emperor series, and then it just all kind of spiraled from there. I've not managed to escape since.
I loved like Rome and the myths and everything when I was a child. I was a really weird little only child, so I was very into all that kind of thing. And then I like lost my interest in it entirely until I was at university. I had no idea what I wanted to study, so I just did the degree that one of my teachers told me was like the chillest degree at Oxford, and it was classical archaeology and ancient history. And I like hated it for the first term, and then I did this topic on the Emperor Tiberius and Tacitus and the way in which these stories are they mutate and become more dramatic and more sort of politicized over time. And I found it so fascinating. And then since then, I just became kind of deeper and deeper, and I can't get out.
That happens. So mine was really similar, actually, to yours, which I love, because I did also devour that series.
They're good books.
Yes. So I did a BA in publishing, actually, and then about a year into it, I found this book on the First Ladies of Rome. And I'd never done classics. I'd never done anything like that at school. And I said, no, I want to do this. And actually my mum, who is sitting right there, said, no, you're finishing your degree, which I'm very glad about. But in the meantime, I carried on reading it and eventually, yes, read everything I possibly could. And then eventually quit my job and just started doing archaeological digs and things like that. And I've never looked back, really. It's been a delight. But you can't get out. You are stuck in it.
Those were great and varied answers, and I feel like we sort of touched on my next question, which is a bit more specific. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Roman women, and sorry, Jess, particularly elite Roman women, navigated the boundaries between the domestic space and the public space of the forum, and what were the sort of issues with that and sort of benefits, rewards, as well as sort of challenges and consequences from moving in between those spaces. And also, firstly, how much mobility did they really have?
I think it probably depended a lot on the specific time period you were talking about in terms of the mobility that they had. It also depended a lot on where they were kind of born into the social order of Rome. But speaking specifically to Fulvia, who is where sort of the majority of my research has been, I think one of the things that really made her quite singular in the history was the way that she moved between the sort of private life, the domestic life of women, and then the public life of politics. I think one of the things that the men of her time found most egregious about her was that she made a point of conducting political business in the domestic space, because women couldn't go into the Senate House. She couldn't be a senator herself. But at a certain point in her life, she was functionally their peer. They were looking to her for advice, or she was doing shady deals and selling countries and what have you, just, imperial things. And she would hold those meetings in her home. She would have people come to the private part of her home, and I think people like Cicero were really offended by that. But I think it's one of the things that please correct me if I'm wrong here, but to my knowledge, she is sort of the first Roman woman that we know of who did that. I think before that there were of course other women who were interested in, who were moving in political spaces and were very ambitious on behalf of their sons or their husbands, or who were sort of notable figures in society for being amazing mothers, like Cornelia of the Gracchi, or for being promiscuous, like Claudia Metelli. But Fulvia was kind of the first one who was like, I just want to be in power. And she sort of went about that in a way that was very almost kind of revolutionary, I think, for the time.
Yeah, I think certainly as well, Fulvia is so much more explicit and open and public about what she's doing and the power that she is working to gain for herself and is exerting on her own account than the vast majority of Republican women would have been. Because there are, I think, other women who are, becoming incredibly significant power players in this period and even before. But what they're doing so differently is that they are, as you said, kind of hiding it behind this ambition for their sons or their husbands. They are never admitting, in the way that kind of Fulvia does, in their self-presentation, that this is something that, I am pursuing for myself, and I want to be a public figure on my own account. I think it's also very hard in this period for Republican women because the boundaries between public and private, it's very clear that the ideal in Rome is that the private space is the space of women and the public space is the space of men. And so much of the Republican system is designed to be kind of exclusively male. But it's hard because those boundaries are not as distinct as we sometimes imagine them to be today. Because in Rome, they don't have this kind of ideal of like private domestic family life. There is always politics being conducted in the home, and the home in town is always a semi-public space if you are a public figure. And so I think these boundaries are already blurred, and then it becomes incredibly hard for women to assess where they can go. And I think what Fulvia does is she pushes those boundaries until, you know, everyone is kind of horrified and there is this huge backlash against her. Obviously, the situation changes again when you have the empire, and then suddenly you have a few women who are part of the dynastic system who very legitimately have these huge public roles. But again, it's very unclear what the boundaries of those roles should be. And a lot of women, Messalina included, fall foul of kind of the testing of where those boundaries lie.
I think from like, calling on the domestic part of that and the visibility of women, the material culture is increasingly showing that women were a lot more visible than we realize. So, of course, people like Cicero will tell you that they shouldn't be ever seen. And, you know, they should only be seen if they're sort of on the loom and in the atrium, and that's that. So actually, it's starting to show that they become present during the day after the salutatio, and they, you know, the man goes out of the house and then the women suddenly appear in the house and they're suddenly a lot more present. And it's obviously difficult to reconstruct that because it's been hidden for a reason. But from, non-imperial level, in normal cities and towns, women were actually doing quite well in terms of making themselves well known. So if I talk about Pompeii as a comparison point, we have women that are incredibly ambitious and being really vocal about it. And there's many, many examples. One famous one is Julia Felix, who was a businesswoman. We don't think she was married. She's probably widowed. But she was being incredibly vocal about being a businesswoman. She even changed the route of one road. So she was doing all sorts of things. And then there was another woman who had a tomb. And she said, so she had two tombs. She made one for herself, and she already had one her husband had made. And she said, oh, no, actually, he's got that one. I acknowledge that, but actually I want my own one. So she's over there. She wasn't dead at the time of the eruption either. So I love this because she's like, oh, yeah, there it is. And everyone's, and also the reception of this sort of thing has made it very, very difficult for people like us to build off of, because we're building off of biases from an elite white male perspective as well.
I feel like that's led very nicely into my next question. Nice. Yeah. So what I wanted to get into a bit more was the role of religion. And I mean, my main comparison point is like Maenadism in ancient Greece, which I feel like was quite different to the Vestal Virgins. So I'd love to know what you think about the role of women in religion and sort of ritual and worship, and what were the implications of that for how they exerted power.
Well, it was certainly a way in which they became very visible in the kind of space of Roman cities and Roman towns. It was a way that they could be honored by the community and acknowledged by the community. But I think there are real boundaries to the power that women are able to exert religiously for the vast majority of their roles. The real exception to that is the Vestal Virgins. And the Vestal Virgins are this group of women who have these extraordinary religious roles. They are obviously virgins. They are involved in essentially the protection of the state from existential danger. And in part because they're sort of extracted from their families and they live together in this sort of strange virginal community, they have all of these much more public and political roles that kind of wives and daughters and things are not allowed to access. So They're involved in kind of protecting important political wills. They are present at big public games. They are really sort of totemic figures in the state, and also very impactful, particularly during the period that you're looking at.
Yeah. One of the powers, I suppose, that the Vestal Virgins had was that they could essentially exempt someone from prosecution. They could pardon someone. In my book, Fulvia, one of the religious cults and rites that is touched on was the rite of the Moderator, which means the good goddess. And there is a lot of mystery around her cult, which is partly because it was more of a plebeian cult, so we don't know as much about it because it wasn't quite as revered by the aristocracy. But also they had a yearly festival which was for women only. Only women could attend this festival. Only women could know about this festival. They would the Vestal Virgins were involved in preparing whichever home was hosting the festival. They would go through and they would remove all statues and masks of men. They would cover the men in the frescoes and the mosaics so that they couldn't be seen. And it's interesting, like writing from a fiction perspective as well, because one of the kind of joys of writing historical fiction is that you do get to sort of fill things in. You get to kind of guess about what might have happened. And I think with the Moderator, there is a lot to guess because there's a lot we don't know. But what we do know for sure is that it was only women at this one particular festival, except for one notable exception, which if you want to know about that, then buy my book.
Again, from a household perspective, it was the household was the woman's domain, and again, this has continued up until very recently, and we have so many examples of shrines in homes that were being used. But one of my favourite examples is when I was writing my book, Plug, coming out next year. I found that there were so many women along this particular road in Pompeii where they didn't have any evidence of males in the home. The reason I say that is because we have graffiti outside of the home that is written by them. It's in their name, so whether they live there or not. But the point is that they were, politically canvassing. And in their homes, they have specific shrines that they've put up that refer to a woman and a man, so, the marriage, but also one shrine that is dedicated to a son of this woman. So it was very much a female thing to control religion and sacred spaces in the home. So it was a very female-oriented part of life, actually, a very delicate, soft part of life, which I think is really, really nice and easy to forget, actually. Mm-hmm. Even though slaves would have been doing the dedications, but they'd have been telling them what to do. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about the intimacy of all of those personal shrines. Like, that's so lovely. And jumping around a bit, because I feel like you've started to answer my next question, which was about, when we're looking at male authors such as Cicero and Tacitus, how do you deal with that? And what are some tools that you can use to interrogate and reassess what we think we know? And obviously archaeology and material culture, but as you say, even that, it's not necessarily straightforward. So in your experience, in your work, what are some things you've come up against and how have you dealt with that?
It's a huge problem, and it is all of ancient history is just an eternal struggle against both the lack of your sources and the sources you do have. And I think that is just redoubled 1,000 times over when you're working with women. And sometimes the biases are very clear. They're very familiar to us. There are certain types of misogyny that are pretty much unchanged. But I think where it becomes harder to deal with is when these are biases that are much more specifically Roman. And so we have to be very careful that we are thinking in the horrible ways that the Romans thought about women, rather than kind of applying the horrible ways that we have thought about women more recently in Western culture to the Roman sources. I think the other thing that can be incredibly useful is looking for the places in the text where something is incongruous within the context of the text itself. So if Tacitus has a presentation of a figure that he really is like pushing, and he generally does, the places where he tells us a story that doesn't fit with that presentation is the place that I would generally start, kind of thinking about, why this doesn't serve Tacitus's narrative, so perhaps we might be able to give it more credit, and we can kind of start from there and begin to build out a wider narrative.
I think with the sort of late Republican period, which is when Fulvia was alive, one of the kind of truly unfortunate things about history is that Cicero was given the kind of unique privilege of being the loudest voice from that period, because so many of his speeches and his letters and his opinions have survived time. And so a lot of...
How do you feel about Cicero?
Don't ask me that, because we will be here until the sun rises in the morning. And I think because of that, a lot of what has kind of been reconstructed in the sort of historiography, often by these academics from hundreds of years ago who were themselves slightly self-important, rich, straight white men who really identified with Cicero, is that the way that we've kind of constructed our understanding of that society and the people who moved through it is very heavily coloured by Cicero. And when you're trying to navigate the sources, especially, as Anna said, when you're trying to learn about the women of the time, it is sort of doubly tricky, because obviously the society itself was extremely patriarchal, even by our standards. And then also the only women who, especially from the late Republican period, whose lives we really know about are the ones who did things that were perceived as wrong or egregious, and that's how their names kind of made it into the history. And then the result of that is that everything that has been said about them has kind of been said either to slander them or to slander the men who they were related to, essentially. And that is one of the problems with learning about Fulvia, is that most of the mentions of her in the primary sources are an effort to belittle one of her three husbands or to insult her directly, but by accusing her of being unwomanly in some way. One of the kind of enduring quotes about her is that, I can't quite remember, I'm going to need someone who knows to remind me who said it, but it's that the only feminine thing about Fulvia was her body, because she was perceived as having such like a masculine personality because she wanted to be in politics, and that to the Romans was so horrifying. So yeah, you definitely have to sort of navigate them with gritted teeth, I would say. But again, one of the benefits of writing historical fiction is that you get to play around with that a bit. And one other thing is that I think a lot of the things that, again, not to come back to Cicero, but the problem is that the woman I was learned about and written this book about, so much of what we know about her comes from Cicero, because the two of them were sort of kicking around at the same time. I don't like the way he talks about my girl, so I don't like Cicero. It is what it is. But one of the things that kind of brings me joy in a way is that so much of what he said about her, especially in his Philippics, that was intended for the audience at the time to be so horrifying and like, oh my God, how could anyone, beyond belief, scandalous, just like disgusting behavior, all of those things are now, I think, the things that draw modern women to Fulvia as a figure. And I don't think he could have ever predicted that, and that makes me immensely happy.
I think another good source that I've found is comedy. Comedy is really good because, like today, we have memes that we all relate to, and the reason we relate to them is because they are universal. And the way comedy works is it's universal. So there is some truth in it. So yes, it's incredibly exaggerated especially then, to like overly exaggerated. But that's always, for me, I sometimes go to that as a source because I think actually they're exaggerating it for a reason because they can relate to it. So that's one way I can get around the bias. But yeah, what Anna was saying about the gaps where there's, that's different, and that is very different to what they've said. But also where it's consistent, I think I just sort of approach it from the fact that they just are incredibly jealous people. They're so incredibly jealous, and the more of a threat they are, it's a bit like today, the more of a threat they are, the more you're going to find out about that person, there is some truth in it. They're being ambitious, sure, but it's because they're going outside of the norms. But yes, it's because they're a threat, basically. So, but yes, there's two little ways.
Just to, touch on that specifically about, the more of a threat they are, the more there is written about them. One of the really interesting things with Fulvia is that during her lifetime, she was considered a threat by many of these men. And as a result, a lot of them were out here slandering her in the forum. And so we know a lot about that. But after her death, when Augustus sort of rose to power and then mythologized his own life and his own kind of, rise to become the first emperor of Rome, part of his sort of propagandist campaign involved removing her from the history quite a lot, except for in very specific ways. And so I do wonder sometimes if there wouldn't be even more to know about her if that hadn't been the case.
Yes.
So it's sort of like, being a threat allows us to know what we do know about her, but then because she sort of came up against, spoiler alert for the next book, came up against Augustus later in her life, the result of that is that then he kind of pushed her aside and sort of tried to remove as much, because also he had such his big thing was that he wanted to sort of make the role of women more conservative than it already was, because in the late Republic, women were sort of like Fulvia starting to kind of sidle on out into public life and maybe, have opinions and talk.
Wild.
And he did not like that. And so he, one of the kind of big kind of social pushes that he had during his reign was solidifying this idea of the Roman matron and playing a very specific role in society and in life. And so it obviously did not serve his campaign for there to be evidence of this powerhouse of a woman who was out here sticking hairpins through people's tongues.
It's interesting, I think, what you just said about like erasure and Augustus' kind of conscious erasure of parts of Fulvia's history, because I think something that we quite often forget is that the Romans are a culture that is so obsessed with commemoration. And part of that understanding of how important your future legacy is a sense that the worst thing that you can do to someone, the worst threat that you can make against your political enemy, is that you will erase their memory for perpetuity. And so we actually see something that we now call damnatio memoriae. It's not actually the term that the Romans used, but it becomes much more common to have a official punishment where you destroy people's statues, you erase their name from inscriptions, and that is something that will come to be used against imperial women kind of as we move into the Principate.
I mean, this just sprung into my mind, but that's what happened to Hatshepsut, the ancient Egyptian, Raven, where are you? You correct me. Empress? Pharaoh? Yes, the female pharaoh. And there are these incredible ruins where her face has been literally scratched out, so it's been happening for even longer than ancient Rome.
It's such a violent thing.
Yes,
Such a violent thing. You're literally violating a woman's memory. And it did happen to men as well, but I just think it was a lot easier. And also, any depictions of women were very... so we had Octavia and we had Livia, who started to be depicted for the first time in public. Madness. And they looked the same. They obviously didn't look the same, but kind of weird, actually, because he was married to Livia, Augustus, and then Octavia was his sister. It's kind of weird. But, they were only allowed to be depicted in this very specific way that harked back to Cornelia, who was the best mother ever. What was it that she said? She said, somebody came in with
My
jewels
children are
on.
my jewels.
That's it. Yeah, it's just
What
like
a pompous...
yeah, exactly. So somebody came in looking fabulous with all these lovely jewels on, and she said, "Oh, I don't need those. My children are my jewels."
Clearly just didn't have good enough jewels.
Yeah. Again, jealousy. And then everybody had to live up to Cornelia. That was it then, you know. So, but they still didn't have an identity because they all looked the same, you know. And then that's sort of gradually, you actually can't tell Livia and Octavia apart a lot of the time. So that'll tell you everything about their identity before anyone was even erased, really. So,
And it tells you a lot about Augustus, no?
it does. It's a bit weird. Yes, actually, yeah. Now I think about it.
Let's get a bit more targeted for a moment. Honor, my dear, you are in the hot seat. And of course, we'd like to assume that everyone in the audience has read her book on Messalina. But if you haven't, could you give us just a few sentences, key takeaways, thoughts, a bit of background on her so then everyone can understand the question that I'm going to ask you next?
So Messalina is the wife of Rome's fourth... I can't count. She is the wife of Rome's fourth emperor, Claudius. So she is in power from Claudius's accession in 41 AD until her violent murder, assassination, execution, it's all a bit murky, in 48 AD. And she is living at an incredibly interesting time, I think, for the role of women in Roman politics, because this is a period in which court culture and court politics is still developing. So obviously we've had the Principate for a while, but one of the things that Augustus does best is he kind of tries to hide the fact that he has essentially established a monarchy by maintaining a lot of the old Republican institutions. As time goes on, as the decades pass, those kind of gradually begin to fall away, and it becomes increasingly clear that almost all of the power is being concentrated within the household of the emperor himself. And when that happens, the people who have the most access to the emperor become essentially the most powerful. And as the wife of the emperor, you are suddenly in a position of immense power, much greater than the vast majority of senators. And so Messalina is still, I think, at the forefront of working out how to use that power. Given that there are still a lot of things that she can't do. She can't obviously participate in politics officially, even though she has this kind of great public persona. And so she has to develop these strategies, kind of creating alliances, using quite like underhand, evil, but pretty clever methods to remove her political enemies and get what she wants at court. And I think she does that very effectively and then begins to fall foul, essentially, of the own court, the court kind of networks that she herself has created. She overstretches herself a little, and there is a sort of court intrigue against her, and she dies this very violent death, accused of bigamy and adultery with like at least 11 men.
So my question about her, which you've just set up for me, thank you. You talk a lot in your book about the anxieties that surround women and women in the domestic space and women as political actors, as we've discussed. But I'm curious about the connection between violence and death and extreme sexuality, because she seems to be one of those figures that really bring those two and marry those two. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that connection.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I guess like there are two ways to approach it, because she's associated both with like the violent deaths of her enemies, and then she is also obviously remembered for her own violent death in Roman history. And I guess you could connect both of them in a sense to her sexuality. A lot of the times that she murders enemies of hers, the Roman sources will claim that it is essentially sexually motivated. Either she was jealous of a woman because she wanted to sleep with her partner, or she hated a man because he had refused her sexually, and so she murders them. And so I think in that respect, the sexuality and the violence are kind of interconnected as this sort of paragon of what is threatening in how the Romans view female nature and female sexuality, because the female is associated in the Roman mind with kind of uncontrolled passion. And so that is uncontrolled passion both on a sexual level and on a sort of emotional anger level. And then in terms of the connection between her violent death and her sexuality, again, we could draw kind of slightly horrifying connections there, in that there is this sense perhaps that this is sort of due punishment to her behavior, that she has overstepped the mark, and that, if you behave in this way, you can expect kind of similar comeuppance. And the Romans are very into sort of exemplary stories of that kind. So I wonder if there is a sort of satisfaction suddenly for the male authors who write about her death in quite gory detail in that trajectory.
I mean, and that level of detail, I mean, I'm not sure that in and of itself can be kind of erotic if there's a lot of emphasis on her body and what is done to her body. It all seems to be in this sort of soupy, deadly, bloody mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And also because she, as Tacitus tells it, and it's all set, her death is set in this kind of remarkably luxurious, sensuous pleasure garden that she has allegedly murdered someone to get her hands on. And gardens are really associated with sexuality and sensuality in Roman culture. So her death scene is set there, and she tries to kill herself and she can't do it. And eventually she is like run through by a centurion, which I think is how Tacitus puts it. So I think, yeah, you could definitely read certain things into that.
It's quite on the nose almost, really. Pivoting to you, Kaarina, same question really, but about Fulvia, which is for those that haven't read your book because it only came out 5 minutes ago. Just a bit of background about who she was. You know, she's obviously very famous, but just the kind of Spark Notes, Wikipedia, a couple of your key takeaways about who she was and what she got up to.
Well, I mean, she's not as famous as she should be, so let's start there.
You're doing the work. You're doing the work right now.
So Fulvia was what I feel like I need to specify. Obviously, when you're writing historical fiction, there's my character of Fulvia, who is very closely based on the real historical figure of Fulvia, but there will be some things that are true for my character that are not necessarily true in the history, either because I've made changes or because we just don't know. So, yeah. I guess I'll speak to the character, but then for the most part, it's as historically accurate as I could make it. So she was born during the late Republican period. The family that she was born into were very wealthy, but not very important. She had ancestors maybe about 100, 150 years before her birth who had made it into top positions in the Senate. But in recent years, her family had very much fallen out of favor, and her grandfather was actually like mercilessly mocked because he had a stutter. And so whenever he would get up to give speeches, the crowds would just stutter at him. And her family had sort of pulled out of the political life, but they were really rich. So she was born into this legacy, and she was basically the sole heir because she didn't have any living brothers to this immense fortune. And that put her in kind of a unique position as a young woman in Rome, in that even though her family was not very prestigious, she was considered a great marriage prospect because she came with this huge dowry. And so she essentially, over the course of her life, realized there's absolutely nothing about me that does not qualify me to be in power other than my sex. And I think that's really dumb. So she became very, very ambitious and basically figured out a way to move to an extent within the system, but also turned the whole system on its head and became one of the most powerful, not just women, but one of the most powerful people in Rome. I don't want to go into too many specific details because even though it happened 2,000 years ago, obviously there's like a spoiler alert if you're going to read the book. So I won't touch on any of the more kind of salacious things about her life. But if you're familiar with the historical figure, all of the anecdotes you're thinking of right now are in the book, I promise you.
Just to orient us, timeline-wise, how far apart are Messalina and Fulvia?
It's about 100 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, A little less, actually. I can't count. I think it's a little bit less. Cent. It's a long time, by the way.
Well, I mean, that was my next question, because I feel like we can look at so many things, particularly in ancient history, as a sort of monolith. And, Roman women, obviously, under 100 years, just under 100 years apart. If you look at the historical accounts of both of these figures, do we see the identical societal concerns being expressed, or is there a difference that you can see? What can you tell us about the different sort of historical, political, cultural context for the accounts that we have of both of them?
I think even though they are less than 100 years apart, their lives, this was possibly the most turbulent time in all of Roman history. Their entire sort of government structure collapsed and then was rebuilt, and a lot of things about their culture shifted. I know a decent amount about Messalina because I've read Anna's book, so I think based on what I know and then the sources with Fulvia, one of the differences that kind of stands out to me is that Fulvia, even though she was seen as this kind of reviled figure of dastardly female ambition and greed and violence, she was never really sexualized in the sources that we have. Obviously, she may have been, and we don't know about it. I think part of that is because, again, a lot of who wrote about her was Cicero, and he was definitely sexually obsessed with some people in Rome, but Fulvia wasn't one of them. So that was never something that was really weaponized against her. Even though she was very ambitious and very political, she was still seen to be, by all Roman standards, a good wife, in that she gave all of her husband's sons, which was sort of the main function of a wife in Rome. And she was never really accused of adultery. The only kind of is actually archaeological evidence that we have that kind of crosses, and I'm sure you know what I'm going to talk about, is that there was a battle, and I won't say any more than that, but she was involved in it in ways, and the soldiers in this battle they would sling, essentially, they made kind of little rocks that were like bullets, and they would sling them. It was one of the weapons that they used, and sometimes they would carve little messages. And in this battle that Fulvia was sort of related to, some of the soldiers on the opposing side wrote some very kind of violent sexual things about her on these bullets and then threw them at her soldiers. But that's sort of the only evidence we have. And it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be this kind of relationship during her era between sexual deviance and political ambition that I think was often kind of levied at the women in the imperial era.
I think you're completely right that the key distinction between the two is the role of sex. And for Messalina, that is utterly defining. And for Fulvia, it isn't entirely. It basically isn't at all. I think that there are actually women in the imperial period that are vilified in a much more similar way to Fulvia. So I think Agrippina, who comes after Messalina, I think would you say there's something slightly more similar to Fulvia in the way that she's attacked?
I definitely think so. I think it was much more about her being ambitious above her station. Because, as we said, their lives weren't that far apart, I kind of have this personal headcanon, if you will, that women like Agrippina, and maybe even to an extent Livia, they certainly would have known about Fulvia. And I like to think that she might have been someone who they almost looked up to, because as far as we know, she was essentially the first woman to kind of step into the political world like that. She was a sort of proto-empress. And so I think I kind of like the idea of, young Agrippina having like a fresco of Fulvia on her bedroom wall, being like, that's my queen. That's who I want to be when I grow up.
I have a question. I have a question for both of you. Yeah. So what do you think about our own... Sorry.
Please.
I'm just sitting here loving this. What do you think about our own biases? Because obviously, as women, we're going to put our own biases on to these women and want them to portray something that maybe they didn't. Maybe these women were more cautious of how Fulvia was presented. What do you think?
I think it's something I was very conscious of when I was writing Messalina, and I think very often there is a temptation when you are dealing with a woman who has been slandered for 2,000 years to try and be like, no, she was amazing. My God, she never made a mistake in her entire life. And I really wanted, and I feel like that's kind of disrespectful to her in a way, because like you want to give her the space to be human and make a lot of mistakes. She's probably about 28 when she dies. So, you know, there's like room for error. So I wanted to definitely like leave that in there.
Yeah, I think it can be very tempting, again, especially in the sort of historical fiction space, when you're writing these feminist retellings, or I like to think of Fulvia as a telling rather than a retelling, but it can be tempting to sort of impose contemporary feminist ideals onto these women. And in some cases that does work really well as like a piece of literature. But I personally wanted to try and avoid doing too much of that, because I still wanted her to feel Roman. And there is obviously going to be, I also think like for a protagonist to carry a book, they can't be entirely good or entirely evil. You kind of can't do this thing where you're like, oh, actually, she was amazing and a saint and she never did anything wrong ever and every opinion she ever had was correct. Because that's really boring to read about. So it's, from my perspective, I wanted her to be not necessarily a likable character. I think there will be people who read it who actually really don't like her. But I want her to be compelling, and I want it to be as close to her story as possible while still being a sort of entertaining work of fiction. But yeah, I think that is definitely something that it's a very easy trap to fall into, sort of imposing our idea of what it would be to be like a feminist or a sort of a great woman.
And I think the other problem with feminism, not a great sentence.
We have the quote that's going on TikTok.
Clip that for
Someone put it on
social
her
media.
Wikipedia right now.
The other problem with feminism is that it's very easy to mistake a woman pursuing her own power in Rome for a woman pursuing power for women. And I think there's a big difference between someone like Fulvia or Messalina being like, I personally would quite like to control a lot of things in this empire, and them thinking, you know, I want women in general to have access to more power, and Roman women simply would not have had the framework of feminism to think about. It is just not. It's just not something that has been like encountered.
Sort of the closest thing that we have, and it's kind of a great example of what Anna's talking about, is that there was a woman who was alive during Fulvia's lifetime called Hortensia, and she gave a speech in the forum, which was itself quite shocking because women didn't often give speeches because, you know, they were supposed to be invisible. And some people hold this up as sort of evidence of like feminist thought in Rome, but I really don't think it's that, because she basically got up in the forum and said, well, I don't think I should have to pay tax because I don't get to vote. And a lot of people interpret that now as her calling for the right for women to vote. But it was not that. It was her calling for the right to rich women not to pay tax. So she was not out here thinking about advancing the female cause. She probably had never spoken to a plebeian woman in her life. She just didn't want to have to pay tax.
Also, if they'd been like, okay, you can vote, but you have to pay tax, she probably would have been sure.
No.
This is not what I wanted. Can I just say one more thing about your initial question before we... I think what's so interesting about the ways in which kind of Fulvia and Messalina are vilified so differently is that they are... I think it really demonstrates that Roman women cannot win when they get into politics, because Fulvia is vilified for being too masculine, and there is this sense that she has kind of transgressed gender boundaries in her own like actions and her own like behavior. And then with Messalina, there is this sense that she is extremely feminine, and that because she is so feminine, her presence in politics is threatening and dangerous. And so in both cases, these women have in some way transgressed and are dangerous and need to be vilified and need to be like ousted from the political realm.
I think as well, it's a reflection on their husbands. Their husbands are effeminate, and therefore they are dangerous. So that was more of why a woman would be attacked, because she was an extension of her husband. She wasn't on her own. She wasn't seen as an individual, an independent person. So she was an extension of her husband, and her husband couldn't control her, and therefore he is effeminate. And therefore he is Greek. And now this is bad. Yes, exactly. So I think it's also more of a reflection on their husbands and them not keeping them under control. Bad.
I'm choosing not to take that personally.
I know.
And oddly enough, I have a bunch more questions, but we have whipped through the minutes. So I'm going to ask one final question to all three of you, and then we are going to open it up to all of you. So the final question is, if you could rewrite one commonly accepted truth about ancient Roman women, what would it be and why?
I have a good one. Actually, we've touched on it a lot today, but that women didn't have any involvement in political areas whatsoever. And yes, it might be from behind the scenes, but from a material point of view and in Pompeii, they certainly were involved in politics, like I said, touched on with the graffiti, but also that they were conducting business, and there's evidence of them giving loans to one another. They almost had, so on the feminist side of things, they were almost looking after one another. We have an example of a woman, Poppaea, I think her name was Note, and she gave a loan to another woman, and the collateral was two slaves. Actually, spoiler, they are in my book. We've got Simplex and Petronus, and it's to another woman, and I just think that's amazing. So no one would ever talk about that. And they were actually conducting. They weren't meant to be, by the way. They had to have guardians to these things if they did it at all, and they weren't really supposed to. So I think that's a definite, finance and politics. They were absolutely involved. It didn't just because they weren't allowed to be. They had some involvement. They had some say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually mine would be very similar to that, in that I think we when we read just the literary texts, you get either the ideal of how women are meant to behave or the extremes of their misbehavior. And I think that there was this huge land in between those things where women actually existed and actually just made things work and did the things that they needed to do to live. Almost no woman would have been, adhering to all the ideals. And I think most men would not have expected that of them. And I think also sometimes people's view of Roman women is to some extent infected by the Greeks, because the Greeks are actually much more...
You made such intense eye contact when you said that.
They keep the women sort of inside much more. They're much less visible in Greece. And I think in Rome, even though there is this ideal association of the woman with the private sphere and there is this exclusion of women from politics, women are, like you said, very visible.
Yes.
And they are kind of, around and about and doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that they exerted economic power like that's fascinating.
Yeah. It's wild. They were renting out. I mean, in Pompeii, we have, again, it's Julia Felix. We have an example of a woman renting out a whole insula, so a whole block that's hers. I mean, that's crazy. And she was smart enough to know that after the earthquake in AD 62, which destroyed much of the town, which nobody really knows about or talks about, she was smart enough after that to say, right, I'm going to convert my private baths into public ones that I can sell out for a fee. She called them the Venus baths. She was very, very smart. And then she said, I've got other apartments. Let's do those as well, to distinguished people. It's amazing how much they had.
And I love the fact as well that is happening at every level of the social scale. So Julia Felix, and then lower down the social scale, and then also the great imperial women have these huge business interests. So a lot of land, but also estates, but also manufacturing. They have I think it's Octavia the younger has a huge kind of warehouse complex down in the Bay of Naples. So these women are engaging in economics at every level.
Yes, there is actually a fish. Now you say it, there's a garum seller.
Really?
In Pompeii. She's female, but she was a freed woman of a garum magnate who was a huge businessman called Umbricius, and she is Umbricia Fortunata. And not only that, but again, she's smart enough to go niche, and she used to sell kosher garum, fish sauce. So her name is around the town, so she had at least one workshop. So yeah. Yes, she's in my book too. A lot of women. Stick them in there. Yeah, but yes, they were really industrial and very smart and they knew how to niche down, definitely.
I think I probably have two answers. The first one is that I would love to dismantle this idea that the only way that Roman women found their way into power was through sex. I think, again, a lot of that is the result of how these women, especially the imperial women, were slandered.
It's Messalina's fault.
Yeah. You know what? Yeah. There is this idea that the only way that they could find power was by seducing a powerful man and then building a career off of that, and that is kind of simply just not true. But it has become the sort of widely understood thing about the women of this time period. And then the other one relates less to the historiography and more to like film and television representations of Roman women, which is just that like they had body hair. Like they weren't all out here with dermaplanned and lasered and like, let's chuck a monobrow in there. Like if you look at a single painting of women, especially from all the ones that survived from Pompeii, and you keep, oh, they're Italian, they were hairy. And that's okay. So I feel like I would love to see a little more representation of that in the film and TV, maybe.
That was an excellent range of answers, so thank you. I feel like that was a good note to end on. So small business owners, it's not all about sex. Bring back the monobrow. Those are like the key takeaways. So over to you all. Does anyone have a question? We've got Martin, who will be running around with the microphone. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask our panelists, or I can keep going, and that is a threat. Okay, no, we've got them already.
Thank you so much, ladies. It was an incredible journey across time, and just hearing the stories of these incredible women and, how they fought for their space in society in the spaces that we often don't get to hear about. So thank you so much. I suppose my question is, we've heard a lot about women in adulthood, and I'd be really interested to hear about the sort of research and material culture that surround Roman women before they become women, Roman girls, and their experience of how they kind of raised and how they kind of prepared for a life of marriage and childbearing.
I love this question. From an ordinary person point of view, they were prepared very early. They were prepared very early to understand that they weren't meant to be seen. They were prepared with toys as well, so they would have a doll that would go when they became a woman, when they married. But the toys were sort of based around, it's a bit like actually gender roles today, being given a vacuum cleaner when you're little, or washing machine or things, or their little kitchens. They were prepared in that way with toys. Boys were too. Military strategy, for example, but girls were also. So they would be following their mother very closely around the house and learning from her. They would also have, usually if you were upper class particularly, you would have a nurse as well that was teaching you the ways. But yes, from a material culture point of view, we really can't find them, which is sad. We know that girls were going to school with boys sometimes. Again, if you were privileged enough, they probably listened in. I mean, childcare is easy enough. If you're sending your other child, you might be like somewhere. I've got this image of like a palestra with all these women hanging around with their children and, childcare, because how else would you do it? There's actually alphabets in the palestra at child level in Pompeii. So absolutely, girls would have been doing that, but it's very, very, very hard to find them. Unfortunately, we only really hear about them in epitaphs, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that there are literary sources that just refer to girls attending elementary school, the same elementary schools as boys, kind of in passing as though this is like a normal thing. It's really hard when you're working with the literary sources because individual women generally only enter the literature on their marriage. And it's very hard to work back from that. We have some general comments. And what we can say, which I think is so interesting, is that even though women are being excluded from public life. They're being given, if you're an elite woman, an exceptionally wide-ranging education in a lot of cases. So reading and writing, but also like literature, philosophy, history. And so I think there's this fascinating disconnect between the sort of educative background that a lot of the women are having, and then the role that they're being expected to play. And I think that is a tension that probably comes through for women like Fulvia, who feel like they're equipped to kind of embark on this political career and are being prevented from doing so.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially towards the sort of late Republican period, you had these girls who were born into these like aristocratic or very wealthy families who, as Anna said, were being given quite thorough educations. They were learning all about Roman history and philosophy and politics, and to then expect them to just sort of make motherhood their entire identity and never have any opinions about these things that they've been taught about, I think is sort of, I can't believe that anyone was surprised that they became ambitious.
Hi, really enjoyed it very much, obviously. I get that, so Roman women is like a small, relatively unseen part of like Roman history, and out of that, Roman lower class women are kind of more unseen than sort of upper class women. I guess that's a really big generalization, sorry, but like, my question would be, is if like you're in like a really poor working class community in ancient Rome, or like you live in the Subura or Aventine or whatever, and like you don't have a paterfamilias, or like your husband and brothers are off in the legions getting killed by Britons or something. Like, is there like a line in poor communities where like all those ideals about, oh, we should only be indoors, that's our domain, all that just disappears because you've got to bring the bacon home or something? And like, does that mean poor communities are unintentionally more progressive than the upper class communities? And yeah,
I think that's a really lovely question. That last bit that you said is a really good characterization of it. It's a necessity to. I tell you what. So my family are from the East End, and I sometimes think about that because again, it's a necessity of industry that you have to go out and do this. This is why I brought up the childcare, because you have no option. You'd have to take your children with you to work. So it was, and in that way, you're not invisible because you're part of a community. The more I look into ordinary people, the more I realize that they were very community-based. They were resolving all of their issues as a result and, a cause of community, because they could rely on that. And in a way, the further up you get, the more isolated you are, because it becomes more competitive to survive. Whereas down there, we're all surviving together, so we have to kind of be in this, otherwise it's not going to go well for any of us, So yes, I would say the further down you get, and I think it's more acceptable as well, because they weren't being slagged off in the media. So it was much less an issue of survival if you did something out of the norm, and it would actually encourage your survival, actually, if you went outside the norm. If women were in business as much as men were, the lower you go down. It's just, it was a necessity. Yeah.
There are some wonderful also images of women and men working alongside each other in kind of on like funerary plaques and things. There's a relief that I'm thinking of where like the woman is sitting doing the accounts while the man is he a butcher? Or is he making shoes or something?
Yes, yeah. With the table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, even kind of not in the poorest slums, would have been like working together as part of family businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ostia Antica is a really good source. This is what Anna was just referring to. There's so many epitaphs. I mean, there's a female midwives. There's an epitaph of them, and it's purely women in it. But they were also aspirational as well. They were seeing these things go on, and as the girls said earlier, there's the homes of elite people were very open, so they would be walking past these houses, deliberately seeing inside. And that was something to aspire to as well. So there was very extremes of wealth. But yes, the lower down you get, the more it was just normal to go to work because you had to.
So continuing a theme where I think people have been asking about different lenses on women and Roman society, I'd love to hear a little bit about what the kind of modern queer lens can tell us about women in Rome and Roman society more broadly, and then also in a flip to the kind of conversation you're having about feminism and how that can both help and sometimes hinder our understanding what maybe the modern queer view obscures or continues to obscure about Roman society.
Love that question. I think, again, it is quite easy to fall into the trap of imposing contemporary ideas about queerness and queer identity and sexual orientation onto the Romans. And obviously, to an extent, some of those things are innately human. But, for example, one of the things that I found really interesting studying Roman history as a young queer person is that in Latin, they don't necessarily have words for straight, gay, bisexual. These weren't really concepts that the Romans were bandying about. Their idea of sex, or there's sort of two kinds. There's obviously like sex for procreation and then sex for pleasure. And a lot of their ideas around like the politics of sex was much more about giving and receiving. So if you were a Roman man, like a high position of power, it was considered very normal for you to take male lovers as long as you weren't the bottom. If you were bottoming, that was a big problem because that's for women. And so that it was sort of tied up into their ideas of masculinity and femininity, but they didn't necessarily have these kind of strict ideas of monosexuality and sort of heteronormativity that we have in society today. So I think it is very interesting to sort of look back on not just the way that we see them, but also the way they spoke about each other. A lot of, and I'm sure we'll be able to speak to this as she's researching it, but a lot of the sex scandals that were happening in Republican Rome, a lot of the accusations that were being kind of thrown across the Forum and the Senate House, it wasn't so much about, oh, you're sleeping with a bunch of men, that's pretty gay. It was like, oh, well, I heard that he bottomed. That's pretty embarrassing. One of the sort of famous things that was said about Julius Caesar, and obviously we'll never know for sure if this is true. I like to believe that it is, was that when he was a young man, he was sent as a sort of political envoy to the kingdom of Bithynia. And while he was there, he became very close with the king of Bithynia. And they hung out a lot. They spent a lot of time together. And then when the king of Bithynia died, he bequeathed all of his lands and his fortune to the state of Rome, inspired by Caesar. And so there was a lot of talk about why that might be. And when Caesar sort of started to come to prominence in his own right later in his career, people often called him the Queen of Bithynia as a way to sort of slander him. Caesar was very promiscuous, just as a historical figure. And the idea that he never bottomed once in his life is kind of absurd to me. But, I'm sure he would go to his grave swearing that he never did. But statistically.
Another great Caesar quote is people called him every woman's husband and every man's wife.
He was getting around.
It's so cool. Also really impressive because I think he was bald by that point. They also called him the bald adulterer.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh my God. No. But queer theory in Roman history. Back to that.
She hates feminism and the bald community. Can you imagine?
Can't believe we're filming this.
I love it so much. I will try and save. No. Do you know what I think as well? So later in history, and not my area obviously, we have women living together who were living together, but they were actually living together.
Roommates.
Exactly.
Besties.
I am sure that this happened in Pompeii. I am absolutely sure that it would have happened because, what a strange... I just don't think it's possible for it not to be a thing. I think it was more normal and just so casual, as in that, we're like, we're talking about and trying to identify, I think they were just used to it, actually. And I think this would have been far more usual, particularly when women didn't have husbands, they didn't want to relinquish the power to them or their finances. It's natural that those sort of relationships were going on, and it would have supported them, actually.
And also particularly because women can own property in their own right in Rome in a way that women cannot in a lot of later history. And so obviously there is a great deal of societal pressure to marry. Although women actually can't be forced to marry by their families in Rome. That's probably a bit of a moot point in the majority of circumstances. But particularly if you're widowed, or if you're an heiress like Fulvia was, you can own all your own property. And so I think there are more opportunities for women to create kind of environments that are not just them living with men. Although, of course, there is such societal pressure to kind of enter into those heterosexual marriages that I think that remained the norm, even if it wasn't always the economic necessity.
I think also when it comes to sort of like queer history in ancient Rome, there is this sort of gap where records of sapphic romance should be. And I think part of that is because they just weren't talking about women in general. And then I also think part of it is because they weren't necessarily, there was, and correct me if you think this is wrong, but I feel like there wouldn't have been this sense of threat by the sort of like socially dominant power, because for them sex was the sort of the power and the shame involved in sex was all around the act of penetration, and this were sort of like, specific idea of sex. And so I feel like this idea that as an elite Roman woman you could be dirtied by sleeping with multiple men or by cheating on your husband, I don't think that they would have felt the same way about two elite Roman women sleeping together. I think they would have just been like, oh, they're just reading poetry, they're just doing whatever women do. I don't think it necessarily would have been like, oh my God, the scandal.
It is certainly that there are instances where it's used as an insult, innuendos of lesbian relationships. But I think you're so right that the reason that this is not much more prominent in the Roman consciousness is because this is not seen as threatening. And I think a lot of people probably, it wouldn't even really have crossed their mind as sex, because the act of penetration is just so central to the way in which sex and sexuality, as you were saying before, is defined in Rome. And so when that isn't present, I think that, I think honestly, a lot of people would just not even have thought about it when they thought about sex.
Elite Roman women were restricted and restrained, and I understand, well, I don't know much about the Romans. I understand that once they popped out 3 kids, they could do more. What could they do after having 3 kids that they couldn't do before?
It is, yeah. So it comes in under Augustus. So Augustus institutes this kind of program of legislation on marriage and on adultery. And the way in which he justifies a lot of this is he uses his rhetoric of, we're not having enough children and our society is going to die. And this is rhetoric that we're pretty familiar with now, I think. And it's all tied up, as it so often is, with this idea of like the rejuvenation of the nation. We need to kind of create good Roman stock. And so one of the ways that he tries to kind of incentivize people to have children, he institutes a lot of like financial punishments on people who don't have lots of children. One of the ways that he incentivizes them is that he gives these rights to women who have 3 children. They're literally called the rights of the 3 children. And you're basically freed from guardianship. So Roman women can always own property, and probably in the majority of cases, guardianship was just rubber stamping. It really does, when we look at a lot of the evidence, look like a lot of women are anyway acting on their own account, particularly if you're not wealthy enough for people to be concerned about the patrimony. But it removes the need to do that. So you can officially on your own account make whatever financial transactions you want to. And so I think it is, yeah. So, Oh, well, as in...
Not if no one finds out.
Yeah, you can do that as long as you get away with it.
This is the theme here, isn't it? Basically.
That actually, at the same time, Augustus institutes the first laws against adultery. So it's like he gives and he takes.
Also, adultery in ancient Rome was defined differently to how we would define it. I believe it was defined specifically as sleeping with a married woman.
Yeah, so a single man could commit adultery if he slept with a married woman, but a married man sleeping with, I don't know, like a prostitute is not adultery. Very convenient.
I believe we have time for one more.
So we talked earlier about the Roman obsession with legacy. How much do you think these powerful women were thinking about their legacy and motivated by that versus just exercising agency and surviving? And what do you think they would think of their legacy today?
Oh, I literally, this is like the way I start my book, because memory was, like Anna was saying earlier, so important to them. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, what's the point in living if you're not going to be remembered? So in Pompeii, as an example, we do have women commemorating themselves. The one I mentioned earlier, Nivolia Taiki, she has made this tomb for herself to be commemorated. We also have Eumachia, who made a whole portico for herself in her name. We don't know what it was for. It might have been for selling slaves. It might have been for the fullers, so the launderers. But the point is that she did it. She was from a family of bricklayers, and she had men in the family that were prominent politically, but she decided to do this for herself. That was a commemoration for her, and now we're still talking about her. And then we have other women who have statues. It's incredibly rare, but it does happen. Epitaphs are one of the main ways to do this. And if you see one that is outside of, you know, she was the sweet wife and this and that, it's really rare. And it's lovely that, yes, sweet wife, nice. But it's usually sweet wife because she did the things that a wife should do. And that's usually the formula. So if you find one that's commemorating something else about this woman's life, it's such a joy. Like the midwives that we were talking about earlier, they were so proud of their occupation that they put it on or the vegetable seller, the female vegetable seller on Rome with their little cucumbers on the table. She's so proud of that. And that's a commemoration. And I just love that very, very much. But yeah, so there's different levels.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that goes right down the social scale. So we even find kind of people who are enslaved paying in to essentially funerary insurance schemes almost to ensure that they have some form of commemoration. And I think that is true of empresses too. Agrippina very famously writes memoirs, which are now tragically lost to us, but she was clearly trying to shape her presentation in the future in a literary sense as well. I wonder whether that thread of Roman obsession with memory is so strong that women like Messalina would have preferred to be slandered and talked about than not to have been talked about at all. It is very clear that the ultimate punishment is damnatio memoriae in Rome. Much, much worse than just being kind of said terrible things about. That was not a sentence. But then, of course, it might feel different if you were actually reading them about yourself. So who knows?
One of the things that I found the most compelling and heartbreaking about the historical figure of Fulvia when I first learned about her was that she had lived this incredible life and done all of these amazing things, but no one seemed to know who she was, even though people knew her husbands, they knew her friends, her enemies, but no one really seemed to know who she was. If they did, they only knew her as the wife of Mark Antony, and that was sort of the extent of it. I think that she probably would have been someone who was very swept up in this idea of legacy, both because she was Roman and it was such a large part of their culture, but also because she was someone who was very aware of the climate of the opinion of the people and how the way that you were perceived by Rome could shape your ability to have power and your ability to achieve things. And so I think it does make sense that she would have carried that logic into thinking about how she would have been perceived after her death. And I think one of the great tragedies of her life is that because of how things played out, she didn't have any control over how she was perceived after her death, and instead it was men like Octavian and Cicero who got to entirely write the narrative about her, which I think is really awful, and was part of kind of what inspired me to write about her in the first place, because I think she would want to be remembered, I mean, full stop, but also to be remembered for all of the amazing things that she did, and not for the fact that her husbands were a bit insane.
Hi, I just had a quick question about, you mentioned you were talking about the graffiti, and I wondered, when the three of you were doing researches for your separate publications and books, whether you had sort of doubts where, for example, imagine a woman wrote her name in abbreviation, and they did that all the time outside of inscriptions in graffiti. But the people who translated it in the modern day said, oh, Q is for Quintus, not Quinta. Do you see what I mean? So there's that sort of bias. You don't know if so many women who wrote their names or had ownerships or stamped their names were mistranslated as males by modern day epigraphers or, 20th century epigraphers.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible, and it does come down to our biases as well as ancient ones, and it's definitely a danger. But the graffiti is a danger in itself, because it's always where you come up with some really strange stuff, and then try and track it down, and it doesn't exist or didn't ever exist, or But that is a lovely perspective that I actually hadn't really thought about. So I'm practicing my own biases, and even I think. When they do show up in graffiti, there's a really good one. There's one where this man's saying, I really fancy Sally, whatever her name is. Let's go with Sally. And then it's really strong. No, where did that come from? And then she replies saying, basically, nah, not interested. And then he replies back like, oh, come on, please, meet me by the blah, blah. And then there's nothing. Which I just love. It's so sassy. Sassy Sally. But that's exactly it. These biases show up all of the time, but the ones that I know of women, they are quite big graffiti. They're trying to make a point, and it is clearly accepted. So, yeah. But that's a lovely thought. I'll keep that in mind. And actually, when I was writing my book, I've written it from a similar perspective, where I'm trying to reconstruct the lives of these women and these men, and I started writing from the perspective of men only, and I had to rewrite it because I was like, oh, wait, hold on a minute. I've done exactly what I say not to do. I had to write the whole thing again. So
the problem with feminism.
Yeah. Exactly, the problem with feminism.
That's really interesting. I also had never thought about that. And I'm thinking about some of the stamps of trade kind of potters and things, and I wonder how many of those we've just completely assumed are male.
Yes. It's just really interesting. Such a good point. Yes, thank you.
The other thing is you never really, because I'm an archaeologist myself.
Yeah.
And I quite often, sometimes here doing the secondary source research, have to take their work because the graffiti is gone.
This is it, exactly.
You can't go back and see how many of these people who were women were now interpreted as men.
Exactly.
So true.
Exactly that. And they're often assumed as something that they're not. So, a problem in Pompeii with the graffiti around women is that for a while, were assumed to be prostitutes. And that was it. For ages, they were just, this is a prostitute sign. Why? What's that got to do with anything? She's talking about, electing this certain person for office, and you're calling her a prostitute, and it's nuts.
I like the fact they're accepting that sex workers can be interested in politics.
But also that good. It's pretty good, actually. Yeah, that's true. Not making the point they thought they were. But it's so true, yeah. It's like layers of bias that you have to wade through.
Gone quite over, which I feel like is a lovely problem to have. And before I thank these three, I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been such a special night that's been in the works for 3 months, maybe? Quite a while. So thank you, everyone. And just a final plug before we burst into very loud applause. We have Kaarina signing books outside. Honor also wrote Messalina, which you can buy. It's unbelievable. And as Jess has mentioned a handful of times, she has a book coming out next year. Sorry.
I just don't know how to
No, it's good. And I'm also going to plug all three of you. So they all have stuff coming out. They're all incredible, talented. Thank you so much, all three of you, for your fascinating, thoughtful, and quite funny answers. So thank you.
Thank you.